good to be with you. A few months ago, I had the privilege of going with our high school students to their winter camp. And the first night, Kevin, our pastoral resident, actually made everyone play this game. And ultimately, everyone ran around and got into different groups and he would say a number, and everyone had to get into a group with that number of people in it. And after we got into a group with that number of people, he would ask us a question. And so this was an icebreaker game, so everyone could get to know each other. And the first few questions were like, if you ever had to get a tattoo, what kind of tattoo would you get? Or if you could have a superpower, what superpower would it be? All fun, lighthearted questions. Then Kevin switched it up and asked, if you had 24 hours to live, how would you spend it? Suddenly, the tone of the entire room dramatically changed. Now, there was a couple people who said stuff like, oh, I would rob a bank. But it was crazy to me that a majority of our high schoolers, not just like a little bit of a majority, a large majority of our high schoolers said something along the lines of, I would make sure my family and friends knew how much I loved them and I would spend the day with them. Now, I don't know about you guys, but most high schoolers are not known for the way that they value and appreciate daily their family. And yet, that one question reframed things and helped all of us reprioritize what was most important, myself included. As soon as we all in that room were confronted with the idea of our ending, our priorities were rearranged. And the tone of everything changed. And while it was a fleeting moment, because the next question was something ridiculous, it really did help all of us confront a truth most of us try to avoid, which is we are all going to die. Yves Congar, a French priest and theologian, said, there are ultimately two important, absolutely supreme moments, the present moment and the moment of our death. Basically, that means there are two moments that are guaranteed, the one we're in right now and the one where we die. That's it. Morbid, maybe, but true nonetheless. We don't like thinking about death, do we? I mean, our entire culture is built to either postpone death, push it to the side. I mean, most of us have never had a day where we've woken up and thought to ourselves, you know what, today I have the day off, I'm gonna go stroll through Colma. Right? We don't do that. We don't want to even be confronted with the reality of death. And while it would be easy to say that our culture is unique in the history of the world, and the way that we pretend death isn't actually going to come for all of us, I don't actually think we're that unique. You see, the Apostle James, who wrote the letter of James we've been going through since the beginning of the year, he actually had to put the temporary nature of life in front of the face of his church as well, all the way back in the first century. And it wasn't because James had this, desire to be morbid or to keep people from being happy in the life that they had, but actually the exact opposite. In fact, James realized that he was seeing problematic fantasies that his church was living into, that he wanted to confront so that they could instead live into the reality of who Jesus was and what he had done for them. And today, we're going to talk about what those fantasies were and how we also can avoid them. So if you're able, would you stand for the reading of God's word? We're going to read from James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. James says, now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you don't even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. Thanks be to God. You may have a seat. Now, we know that a majority of James' church, which was in Jerusalem, was actually really poor. And we know that because of a bunch of other clues that we get throughout the New Testament and historical sources that point to the fact that Jerusalem at the time was a very stratified society. So there were super rich people and there were super poor people. James's church needed a lot of help from churches in the surrounding area. So we can assume James was predominantly surrounded by people in the poor bracket, okay? But when you read this passage, you also have this thought like, well, if everyone in James's church is poor, who is James actually writing to? I mean, poor people don't generally think about traveling and business and all these kinds of things. They're thinking more about survival. Well, scholars have all different kinds of opinions, but the one that I find the most compelling is that there was also this swath of a merchant class that had developed in the ancient Roman world, particularly in Jerusalem. And they actually were marginally richer than most of the poor people. Again, stratified society, so super rich, but then this merchant class traveled for work and basically sold goods to the elite rich people. And because of that, they had just enough money, but a little bit more. Enough money, but a little bit more. My guess is that James is writing to these merchant class of people, particularly because if they had found their home in the church, they suddenly wouldn't have just been the merchants that the elites kind of cast to the side. Suddenly they were in a community where they actually were the rich people and they could boast about it. So my guess is James is talking to them. The reason this is significant, though, is because of how it ties into our context. If we're honest with ourselves, most of us are the kinds of people who have enough to survive and a little bit more. Am I right? Right? If you've gone out to dinner in the last few weeks, you have enough to survive and a little bit more. This brings us to the first fantasy that James is actually warning his church against. And the first fantasy is the fantasy of more. In verse 13, he says, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this city or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money." Anyone in here consider themselves a planner? Raise your hand if you consider yourselves a planner. Okay. James here is talking to planners. And if you're in here and you're like, you know what, I'm not the kind of person that develops a 5-year plan. Well, let me tell you, you're going to be in this category in a second. Because there are 3 types of future planning James is actually calling out in this one verse that I think all of us can find ourselves in. The first type of planner is a planner for more experiences, right? We love looking forward to exciting and fun and pleasurable things. James says his church was talking about venturing off to this city or that city, planning on travel and going. Of all the types of future planning, this is my Achilles heel. When I feel bored or stuck or angry or lonely, I plan fun stuff. I really like looking forward to fun stuff. Now, I'm trying to do this media fast for Lent, and I'm trying to fast from as much of it as humanly possible. And one of the apps I had to delete from my phone was Airbnb. Because I find comfort in thinking about more experiences to come when my present doesn't actually feel the way that I want it to. Anybody understand that kind of feeling? Instead, I actually want to retrain myself to find God in the present so that He can be my comfort. The other side, though, to fantasizing about future experiences is the opposite. Because when we have a present or a past that has been deeply disappointing, sometimes we can get to a place where we expect nothing will change or it will continue in a downward trajectory, right? And when we expect more hard, bad, frustrating, disappointing, devastating types of things, we can actually catastrophize what's to come instead. And both of those things actually cripple us from living into the present and trusting God with what He actually has given us in this moment. So that's the first portion of the planning fantasy of more experiences. Second, more time. Now, this is a huge one in the Bay Area. James says not only are these people going to this or that city, but they put a time frame on it, right? They're like, oh, we're going to spend a year there. One of the biggest assumptions all of us actually make is that we're going to have more time later and that we're actually in control of it. If you just Google like time management, the number of books that you can buy on time management is daunting. Most of Silicon Valley culture is all about like trying to figure out how to make our work week shorter so we can actually manage time better. So many of us have tools on our phones to be able to help us to manage, just squeeze the most out of the time that we have. There is an endless supply of all of this. And while we are all aware of the fact that it's the one resource we can't multiply, it's the great equalizer among all of us, we generally assume we get more of it. One day after we're successful, then we'll spend time with our kids. One day we'll invest in our marriage. One day I'll decide I want to dedicate my life to the Lord. One day I'll marry her. One day I'll give that thing that's crippling me, I'll give it up. One day, one day, one day. The fact of the matter is, you may have one day when those things happen, but the only day you're guaranteed is today. I have never been more aware of how quickly time goes than the last 19 months since my oldest daughter was born. And her constant changing is evidence to me of the fact that when tomorrow comes, it is not going to look like today. It's not. And I don't want to miss what happens today. So that's the second portion of the illusion, is more time. The third is more money. James says that these people, they went here and there, they were going to spend a year there, but also they did it specifically for business and to make money. Did you know that the earliest example that we actually have record of a market crash was in Holland in the 1630s? Can you guess the market that bubbled up and then crashed? Tulips. Tulips. Now, this period of time is called tulip mania because tulip bulbs, when they first came to Holland, were collected as a status symbol. I read a report this past week that said that some bulbs would have been worth what was equivalent to $1 million in today's money, in today's currency. It completely rearranged their entire economy. The Library of Economics and Liberty wrote, "The rage among the Dutch to possess tulip bulbs was so great that the ordinary industry of the country was neglected, and the population, even to its lowest dregs, embarked in the tulip trade." You know what that ended up doing? It ended up meaning that people ended up buying tulip bulbs on credit. And then when the bubble popped, people were completely destroyed in bankruptcy. And while the Dutch now point to tulip mania as a lesson in human greed, humans haven't changed that much, have they, since the 1630s? Humans fantasize and plan to make and keep more money. We all do. That's why we have spreadsheets and 401ks and high-yield savings accounts, and why buying a home seems like you finally made it in the Bay Area. The idea of our future money actually gives us comfort, makes us feel a level of control and security, and helps us feel like, you know what, the future is locked and loaded if I can just have a little bit more. This same fantasy is also why we go into debt, why we assume that we're going to end up making more money than we do today, and we make decisions in the present based on that. We fantasize about more. All of us do it. So if you thought in the beginning that you are not a planner, think again. Now, most of you are probably thinking, well, are you saying that planning is bad? No, I'm not saying planning is bad. In fact, James is not saying that planning is bad. Planning is potentially the wisest thing you can do in some areas of your life. More isn't even bad. But James is issuing a warning about what fantasies we're living into when we plan and long for more. Do you involve God in your planning? Does he have a say in the trajectory of your experiences, of your time, and your money? Christians use the word stewardship a lot. And ultimately, we are stewards of what God has given us, the experiences, the time, and the money. Now, stewardship is not ownership. Stewardship is taking care of something that's been entrusted to you when you know that it belongs to someone else. James here is reminding his church that they were planning for more, like they owned their lives, when actually they were just stewards entrusted with what God himself owns and what God himself considers precious. That was the first fantasy, the fantasy of more. But the second was the fantasy of human control. In verse 14, he says, "Why, you don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes." I don't know about you, but depending on how you say that verse, it can make you pretty uncomfortable. I mean, telling someone you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes doesn't actually sound that encouraging and complimentary. I can imagine, I think her name's Miss Trenchard in Matilda. Yeah, I can imagine Miss Trenchard saying that to like one of the kids. "You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes." Like something like that. That's intense. It also runs completely against the cultural norms that we have been raised in, right? Our voice matters, you're important, we control our own destiny. James seems here to be saying exactly the opposite, right? Ultimately, if your life is just gonna float away, it doesn't matter that much. I mean, he's not the first biblical writer to say this either. In the book of Ecclesiastes, the writer cries out, "Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless." The word meaningless is actually derived from the word vapor or mist. So James is actually alluding all the way back to Ecclesiastes. And in the Ecclesiastes verse, the voice of Ecclesiastes is reminding his audience the same thing. Their life is temporary, fleeting, and impermanent. Then in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus actually tells a parable that mirrors this idea too. It's about this rich guy who has this amazing season of harvest, and he just harvests too much. And he's like, "My goodness, what am I gonna do with all my crops? I know, I'm gonna knock down all my barns, build bigger barns so I can keep all of my crop, and then I'm gonna sit back and relax and enjoy my life." God responds to him and says, "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be for whoever stores up things for themselves but is not rich toward God." Control is a tempting fantasy to live in. I would actually argue that for people that don't know Jesus, it's the only fantasy you actually can live in. I don't know how you could possibly function if you couldn't assume that you were in control. But the thing about following Jesus is you get your eyes opened up to the reality of that fantasy, a fantasy that applies to everyone, just like it applied to the rich man in the parable. But while learning that might feel harsh and unkind to some or people that don't actually know who Jesus is, for us, it becomes amazing good news. Suddenly realizing my life is a mist is not condemning me to a life that doesn't have control, but it's putting me in the hands of the one who is control, and it gives my life value and purpose. It puts me in the hands of the one who is worthy of trusting, the one who knows all of my moments strung together and who has numbered my days and knows the number of hairs on my head. The book of James has the power to completely upend your life if you let it. But that's the thing about following Jesus. We're actually deciding to live into this upside down, seemingly different reality that makes more sense. Because God is asking us to surrender control of our plans to him. The fact of the matter is, we never had control anyways, and we were living in a fantasy like we did. The act of surrender is actually deciding to live into the truth that God is sovereign over all things, life and death, and we are not. Now, for those of you who feel worried about your future, or you're tempted to plan for more in order to make you feel better, I would urge you, ask God to give you wisdom first. James says, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should do what? Ask God, because he actually is going to give it to you. It's been said that what you think about God is the most important thing about you. And truly, how you think about God how you think God's going to respond to you actually will determine how you think about your future with him and how you end up surrendering control to him. I mean, who'd want to give up control to like Miss Trenchard, right? If you think of God as a tyrant, you're going to have that kind of idea of who you're giving over control to. Or if you think that God is some laissez-faire, like distant God who doesn't actually care about where you are in the present and isn't willing to get his hands dirty, why would you give up control to someone like that? But if the Lord is trustworthy, perfect, enduring, not sick of you, all-powerful, holy, endlessly loving, if he is a just father who is invested in your good, that changes things. And I know for myself that when my heart is the least inclined to surrender control, generally it's always when my vision of him has been warped into someone smaller than he actually is, or something that's untrue about his nature. So we need to be constantly reminding ourselves of who God is if we're going to surrender control to him. And if you want somewhere to start, I would encourage you today to read Psalm 121. Just read through it, meditate on Psalm 121. It's in our surrender of control that we actually get to experience the hands of a trustworthy Father who's guiding us. That's the second fantasy, the fantasy of human control. But the third one, James continues with the fantasy of independence. Have you ever had this feeling when you think you had this incredible new idea and someone around you says, no, that was my idea first? Have you ever had that feeling? My sisters and I bicker about this all the time. And because I'm the oldest, normally I'm right. My whole life, I've always just assumed that because I was around the longest, their memories pale in comparison to mine. But recently, I learned about this phenomenon called cryptomnesia, which is when our brains actually convince us that an idea or thought is our own because we misplaced our memory, and we've actually seen or heard it before. According to an article I read, cryptomnesia is a form of cognitive bias that takes advantage of the brain's tendency to inaccurately recall information in a way that benefits us. It can be as simple as unintentionally stealing a coworker's idea or accidentally recreating someone else's art. You know how there's all these music industry strifes about oh my gosh, you stole my music and are using it as your own? And everyone's like, wait a second, I didn't steal anything. They probably did and just didn't know they were stealing it. Our whole Western world that is radically individualistic, we think we are independent thinkers and that we think for ourselves. But in fact, we do not. We are much less independent than we think. Cryptomnesia proves this. Independence is a fantasy. We are constantly being formed by information and opinions that we consume. The Apostle Paul says in one of his letters, do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed instead. We are always either being conformed into something or being transformed by God. There's no third alternative where we get to be the independent thinkers that decide how we're going to be. It's one of the two always. We're not independent in the purchases we make or the trends we pick up or how we want to make our house or our family better. And for followers of Jesus, this isn't really big news. We know this. And we know that whether or not people believe it, all of us are actually dependent on God for everything. Every single breath that we take is only possible because God made it possible, right? That's why James says, instead you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is you boast in your arrogant schemes, all such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. James is saying here, he's saying, stop living like you can actually be independent. You can't. He's not just saying, you know what, put a trite thing on the end of your plans. Like, you know what, I'm gonna just decide to do this thing if the Lord wills. That's like super Christianese, you know, when that's a real Christian-y thing to say sometimes. James isn't saying just use it as this trite thing like you would say amen at the end of a prayer. No, he is saying that we need to embody that and live like we actually are dependent on God for everything. In the upside-down world of following Jesus, dependence on God is actually true freedom. James doesn't stop here, though. He says that the opposite of depending on God is actually arrogant and evil. And again, we get to these really strong words that James says. And he explains how they're evil in that keeping God out of your plans is sin. He says, anyone who knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it sins. Now, there are two theological categories of sin. There's sins of commission and there's sins of omission. Sins of commission are doing things that you know aren't right, even though you know they're not right, right? Like think 10 Commandments when it says don't lie. You lie, that's a sin of commission, right? It's you actually intending to do something that you know is not right. But sins of omission are what James is actually talking about here. It's when you know there's something to be done that's good and you decide not to do it instead. Think Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan. A man who's beat up and bloody on the side of the road gets passed by all these religious people who offer no help, while the Samaritans were actually hated by Jews at the time, the Samaritan is the one who finally does the good he ought to do. The ones who passed the man committed a sin of omission. Now, we know we're dependent on God. We know that our lives belong to him. We know he wants to be central to our days and our time. And when we deny him access to our thinking and our planning and leave him out of our decision making, James is saying, I'm sorry, guys, but that is sin. It's not just, like, well, you know what? It's not really convenient for me to include him right now. It's actually, it's sin. The tragedy, though, of refusing to include the Lord in your planning is not even that. It's not that it makes God angry or that that your life won't go according to plan if you don't actually put God in the middle. There are plenty of people who don't include God in any portion of their planning and their life seems to go great. Am I right? The real tragedy, though, is that for a follower of Jesus, we don't have to live in those fantasies anymore. We don't have to live in the fantasy of more where we think the future more makes today feel more secure. We don't have to live in the fantasy of control where we have to cling to things and possessions and people in the fear of losing them. We don't have to live in the fantasy of independence where we think it all depends on us, failure is catastrophic and hopeless, and we have no eternal help in it. All of those fantasies can be banished from the way that we think because we know the true source of our life. And who is it? It's Jesus, right? He's the true source of our life. James here is asking something very simple of us. He's saying, lay your plans before the Lord because your life belongs to him. Period. That's it. That's the whole message here. Lay your plans before the Lord because your life belongs to him. Now, if you're like me, you're wondering, okay, that sounds good. How do I do it? Well, I think there's 3 steps that you can start with. First, identify where you're holding back your plans from God. So if we're gonna actually surrender control, we have to figure out where we're not surrendering control, right? We tend to divide up our life into pockets, and some of us have pockets that are easier to give over to God, and some of us have pockets that are a lot harder to give over to God, right? Family, work, church, activities, experiences, what I do with my money, all of those pockets tend to have a different degree to which we're readily able to give them over to God. To figure out which ones you might have a harder time giving over to God, I'd ask yourself these 2 questions. 1, where do I think God's power is irrelevant in my life? Right? It can be subconscious, it can be conscious. But where in my life do I act like God's power isn't going to make a difference? Is it your work? Is it your family? Is it your money? Where do I think his power is irrelevant? And then second, where are you afraid of his presence messing things up? I think a lot of times we don't include God in the places where we're afraid he's going to convict us. And where we're afraid, man, I have this, little nagging sensation that there's going to have to be some repentance or turning around that happens when I actually present this to him. So I'm just going to pretend that he doesn't have any care about this thing. So that's 1, identify where you're holding back your plans. 2, evaluate your stewardship. How are you using what God has given you? Your time, your gifts, your money, your talents. Are you using them primarily to move the needle of your own future? Are you using them selfishly, assuming that you have more time, more experiences, and more money left in what God's going to give you? Or do you include the Lord in what you do and do you include him and understand that everything that you have actually just belongs to him? Do you actively steward your resources to love people well? Do you love your enemies? Or do you use what you've been given selfishly? Evaluate your stewardship. And then third, and this is probably the step that most of us, we can do those two things and then actually not do anything about it. Third step, be obedient to him, right? This is the primary message of the whole letter of James. Your faith is only as good as it is worked out in the fabric of your life. You have to do something with what God has given you, not because you're trying to earn it or you're trying to earn grace or earn acceptance, but because you know how big of a gift you've been given. You got to live it out. Jesus isn't just some pet in your life that you get to enjoy. He's king. He's king over your whole life. Now, faith in Jesus that doesn't compel you to live differently, James says, is worthless. And if you're wondering how to make plans or whether your plans are honoring to him, first and foremost, I would say, pray. Ask him. Again, James says that we can ask God for wisdom and he will give it to us. God actually listens to us, and the more we practice prayer, the more we train our hearts to actually hear his voice. And second, read scripture. None of these things for people who are following Jesus, none of these are revolutionary. Pray, read scripture. This book has got a lot to say about the kinds of ways that you plan things. And you know what? God's voice, whatever you hear when you're praying, is never going to counter what you read and hear, right? God's voice is always going to agree with his word. And so you can actually trust what you hear him speaking if it agrees with what he says here. And then third, seek godly counsel. Find people who actually have a voice of wisdom and who you trust, who can speak godly counsel to you. Most of the time, if you're trying to figure out what plan you have, what to plan, those three sources are going to match. And when they're not aligned or you feel like your plans might not match what God has in mind for you, change them. It's really easy to justify yourself and the voices in your heart. And for sure, my voice inside of me is the loudest. And until we learn what it looks like to be obedient and to surrender what we think, to surrender what we want, we're going to actually miss out on God's best. We actually want to lay our plans before him so that he can give us what's best. Now, back in the 6th century, a man named Benedict of Nursia penned what is now known as the Rule of St. Benedict. And that rule has actually framed the largest, longest-lasting monastic order in the world. And in it, monks are asked to keep death before your eyes daily. Now, monks back then did that in a number of different ways that I think are a little creepy, but they definitely pushed the limits of morbidity for us, okay? Like they had pre-dug graves in the cemeteries that were attached to their monasteries that they would have to walk by every day thinking, that might be mine one day. They used a human skull as a symbol throughout their days to remind them of their mortality. There are examples of churches and crypts in Rome that use human skeletons as decorations and have plaques hanging in them that say, what you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be. There's some real creepy directions all of that can go. And I implore you, do not Google those churches because I Googled them and I was like, oh my goodness. They're haunting. It's really haunting. But even in the middle of me feeling tremendously haunted by all of those images, it did something else too. Because as I've thought more and more about what James is saying in the central question of this passage, which is, what is your life? James isn't just saying, you're gonna die, get used to it, is he? He's reminding his church of the greater promise they already have been given. The reason we avoid death is because of fear, anxiety, and striving. We're afraid of death, it makes us anxious in life, and it fills our life with trying to earn our place. But for followers of Jesus, we get to live in an entirely different paradigm than that, because death is not actually the last word. It's a reality we're gonna face, but it's not the last reality, not at all. The reason James is using such strong languages in this passage is because the hope we have in Jesus doesn't just avoid death, it conquers it. We don't have to fear death because whether we live or whether we die, our life now or later circles around him, always. We get to move from fear to freedom. We don't have to be anxious in life, but instead we can rejoice in the time that we have. Every single breath that we take, we know the source of it, and we know the promise of the life we have in the future. We can move from being anxious to being grateful and content. And then last, we don't have to strive to prove and make a name for ourselves. We don't have to work against this inevitability that we're going to be forgotten, because we can rest assured we're going to be remembered by the one who matters the most and is going to be in eternity with us. His name is actually the only name that's going to matter then. And we get to worship him forever. And while the sting of death is still real, we have hope beyond it. Lay your plans before the Lord because your life belongs to him. I'm going to invite the worship team back up, and we are going to enter into a time of communion. Now, communion is a sacrament the church has participated in since the Last Supper, right before Jesus was crucified. And Jesus knew he was going to die. And while his disciples were constantly frustrated that he kept bringing it up and reminding him about the fact that he was going to die, Jesus kept his death before their eyes because he knew that by his death, they would have life. And so the ushers are actually going to come up and pass the communion elements. And after a time of reflection with the worship team, I'm going to come back up and we're going to take our communion together.